What if a body could die of pure terror, leaving every organ perfectly healthy? A team of explorers, frozen for 80 years, is discovered in the Arctic. Their bodies are pristine, yet their faces are locked in a silent scream. Science has no answers. The only clue is a strange symbol carved into their foreheads, a mark the local elders call a warning. They say it's a predator that feeds on warmth. But is it a supernatural curse, or a new form of life that defies all known biology? The hum was the first thing. A low, constant 60-cycle drone from the fluorescent lights overhead, a sound so familiar to Dr. Elara Vance that she only noticed it when it was gone. In her world, the hum was the sound of order. It was the sound of stainless steel and sterilized instruments, of refrigerated units holding their precise temperature, of a world where every ending had a neat, tidy, and entirely physical beginning. She lifted the digital recorder, her voice a clinical monotone that sliced through the quiet of the university forensics lab. Subject is a male, age 57, obvious signs of sedentary lifestyle and poor diet. Y incision reveals significant atherosclerotic plaque in the left anterior descending artery. No signs of external trauma, no toxins present in the preliminary screen. She paused, her eyes scanning the still form on the table before her, though she wasn't truly seeing a person anymore. She was seeing a beautifully complex machine that had suffered a catastrophic and entirely predictable systems failure. Conclusion, she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. Cause of death, massive myocardial infarction. A textbook case of bad luck and worse cholesterol. Click. The recording ended. The only sound now was the gentle whir of the ventilation system. Methodically, Elara began to clean her tools. Each scalpel, each clamp, each pair of forceps was wiped down, sterilized, and placed back in its precise slot in the tray. This was her ritual, the closing argument in the case of a life. Death was not a mystery to her. It was a problem of physics and chemistry. A body was a collection of evidence, and if you were smart enough, patient enough, and refused to be distracted by the messy emotions that clung to it like a shroud, it would always tell you its secret. Her world was a fortress of explainable fact, and she was its unassailable guardian. There was no room for ghosts in the machine, not when faulty wiring explained things so much more efficiently. As she laid the last gleaming instrument in its place, her phone buzzed against the steel countertop, a jarring intrusion of the outside world. She glanced at the screen. The caller ID was a single, imposing block of text. Norcorp Arctic Research. Elara frowned. She had no connection to Norcorp, a massive energy and logistics conglomerate known for its aggressive expansion into the planet's most unforgiving territories. She answered, her tone clipped and impatient. Dr. Vance. The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, like a river stone worn down by 1,000 transactions. Dr. Elara Vance, my name is Silas Kane. I'm the director of Norcorp's research operations at Station Polaris. He spoke in carefully chosen, evasive terms, his corporate dialect designed to soothe and obscure. I do apologize for the late hour, but we have a situation here that requires a unique expertise and the utmost discretion. Elara's patience was thinning. Mr. Kane, my expertise is in forensic pathology, not corporate discretion. If you have a workplace accident, you should be calling the local authorities. Ordinarily, yes. Kane's voice remained unnaturally calm. But this is not an ordinary situation. We've stumbled upon a rather unique archaeological find. An expedition, vanished in 1947. The HMS Erebus II. The name was vaguely familiar to Elara, a footnote in the history of doomed polar explorations. The records say it was lost to the ice, presumed crushed. It seems the records were wrong. A flicker of professional curiosity sparked in Elara's mind, overriding her annoyance. You found the ship? Something like that, Kane hedged. We found the crew. All 5 of them. And Doctor, they've been recovered, intact. The word hung in the air, intact. After nearly 80 years in the Arctic ice. It was improbable, but not impossible under the right conditions. And you need me to determine cause of death, she stated, already running through the possibilities. Flash freezing, asphyxiation in a sealed environment. Precisely, Kane affirmed. We need a clear, definitive report. This is an incredibly sensitive discovery, and the last thing we need is a media circus fueled by wild theories. We need someone who values facts over speculation. My research led me to you, Doctor. Your reputation for thorough empirical analysis is exactly what this situation calls for. The flattery was as smooth as his voice, a subtle appeal to the very core of her professional identity. He wasn't just offering her a case, he was offering her the ultimate puzzle, a mystery that had been frozen in time, waiting for someone with her specific, rational mind to solve it. The howl of the wind was a physical thing, a constant, scouring pressure that seemed intent on stripping the world down to bone and ice. The tiny ski plane, a gnat in the face of a god, bucked and shuddered as it made its final approach. Below, a landscape of impossible, blinding whiteness stretched to a horizon that blurred into a pale, indifferent sky. There was no color, no variation, just the overwhelming, silent scream of absolute isolation. As the skis scraped against a strip of packed ice, Elara felt a pressure in her chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. This was the antithesis of her lab. Her world was contained, measured, sterile. This was boundless, chaotic, and brutally, primally alive. She stepped out of the plane, her heavy-duty Arctic gear feeling flimsy against the biting cold. The pilot, a man in his 30s named Marco Gallo, hopped down after her, his movements easy and practiced. He had the calm, pragmatic air of someone who had made his peace with living on the edge of the world. "Welcome to Station Polaris," Marco shouted over the wind, a wry grin on his face. Or as we call it, the top of nowhere. He began unloading her insulated equipment cases. "First time this far north?" "Yes," Elara managed, her breath fogging instantly. Marco nodded, scanning the vast emptiness around them. "She's a beauty, isn't she? But you gotta respect her. The land, she doesn't much like strangers. Gets funny ideas about them." Elara gave a small, dismissive scoff, a reflex action against a statement that couldn't be quantified. "The land doesn't have ideas, Mr. Gallo. It's a geological and meteorological system." Marco just shrugged, that easy grin never leaving his face. "Sure, Doc. A system. You stick with that." He gestured toward a cluster of low, interconnected modules about 100 yards away, the only feature in the entire landscape. "Kane's waiting for you. Try not to piss off the system on your way." He winked, but as Elara turned to walk toward the station, the sheer, crushing scale of her surroundings began to press in. The wind wasn't just a sound. It felt like a voice, whispering a language of cold and distance that she had no tools to analyze. The temporary morgue was a single, prefabricated research module, hastily converted for a purpose it was never designed for. The air was cold and recycled, smelling faintly of ozone and antiseptic. It was functional, but it felt temporary, a tiny bubble of human order that the vast wilderness outside could pop at any moment. Against one wall, like 5 enormous coffins, stood a line of long, heavily insulated, refrigerated containers. Silas Kane was waiting for her, dressed in a crisp black Norcorp parka that looked more suited to a ski resort than a research station. His smile was perfectly pleasant and didn't reach his eyes by 1,000 miles. "Dr. Vance, I'm so glad you could make it," he said, shaking her gloved hand. His grip was firm and brief. "I trust the journey wasn't too eventful." "It was a flight, Mr. Kane," Elara said flatly. "They're generally uneventful." Kane's smile tightened fractionally. "Of course. Down to business then." He gestured to the refrigerated containers. "As I said, the entire crew of the Erebus II, 5 men, recovered from a sealed ice cave not 10 kilometers from here. The preservation is remarkable. Beyond remarkable, in fact. He walked along the line of containers, his hand gliding over their frozen surfaces. Given the circumstances, we're assuming the cause of death is straightforward. The ship was lost, they took shelter, their heat gave out. A classic case of death by exposure. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression now serious, a mask of corporate gravity. What Norcorp needs, Doctor, is a tidy report, confirmation of identity, a plausible, scientifically sound cause of death that aligns with the historical record. We just need it on paper. The sooner we can close the book on this, the sooner we can give these men a proper burial and avoid any unnecessary complications. Elara felt a cold knot of resistance form in her gut. This wasn't a request for a forensic investigation. It was a request for a rubber stamp. Kane wasn't a scientist seeking the truth. He was an administrator managing a problem. He had already written the conclusion. He just needed her signature at the bottom. She looked from Kane's polished, expectant face to the 5 silent, frozen containers, and for the first time in a long time, felt the thrill of a genuine, unknown variable. The feeling was equal parts irritating and exhilarating. Kane gave a curt, satisfied nod, as if she had already agreed to his terms. Excellent. I'll leave you to it then. The module is sealed and temperature controlled. You'll have complete privacy. He turned and walked out, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving Elara alone in the humming silence with the 5 frozen enigmas. Privacy, she thought wryly, or isolation. Here, they were the same thing. She took a deep breath, the cold, sterile air a familiar comfort. This was her arena. Whatever secrets these men held, their bodies would tell her. She approached the first container, her gloved fingers finding the heavy latch. With a grunt of effort, she pulled it open. A cloud of frigid vapor billowed out, dissipating to reveal the contents within. And Elara froze. Her mind, a library of every grotesque and tragic end a human body could suffer, went completely, utterly silent. The man on the slab wasn't just preserved. He was pristine. His skin, though pale, had the texture of life. His 1940s-era wool clothing was unstained, his hair perfectly in place, but it was his face that held her captive, that violated every known principle of her profession. His eyes were wide open, the pupils blown wide in a way that spoke not of post-mortem processes, but of active, conscious awareness at the moment of his death. His mouth was stretched into a silent, agonizing scream, the muscles of his jaw locked with a tension that should have been impossible. This was not the peaceful, placid mask of someone who had succumbed to the cold. This was the face of a man who had stared into the abyss and found something staring back. It was a physiological contradiction, an artifact of pure terror preserved in ice, fighting down a wave of revulsion she hadn't felt in years. She leaned closer, her diagnostic gaze taking over. That's when she saw it. On his forehead, etched into the skin with surgical precision, was a symbol. It was a complex geometric shape, all sharp angles and interlocking lines, unlike any tribal marking or historical tattoo she had ever seen. It wasn't scarred over. It looked as if it had been carved into his flesh moments before he died. This single, impossible detail shattered the last of her composure. Kane's neat and tidy death by exposure was not just wrong, it was a laughable fantasy. This was not a case. It was a violation of natural law. Hours bled into one another under the unblinking glare of the surgical lights. The sterile module became Elara's fortress and her prison, a place where all her knowledge came to die. The autopsy of the first explorer, a man identified by his papers as Thomas Finch, geologist, was a descent into madness by 1,000 cuts of data. Her scalpels and saws, extensions of her own hands, did their work. Yet, every incision revealed a new paradox. She took tissue samples from the heart, lungs, and liver. Under the microscope, the cells were perfect. There was no crystallization, no damage, none of the telltale tearing that freezing should have caused. It was as if he had been flash frozen in a billionth of a second, a technology that didn't exist even now, let alone in 1947. She ran toxicology screens. Negative. No poison, no venom, not even a trace of alcohol. She checked for signs of asphyxia, for cerebral hemorrhage, for air embolisms in his veins. Nothing. The man was, by every metric available to her, in perfect health. The only anomaly was the final, terrifying one. Connecting his head to the portable neurological scanner, she ran a deep scan of his brain tissue. The results made her feel cold in a way the Arctic air outside never could. The man's amygdala, the primitive fear center of the brain, was incandescent. It was lit up on the scan like a supernova, indicating a level of pure neurological terror so extreme it had no clinical precedent. It was a brain that had literally been frightened to death, without any physical cause for the fear. She stepped back from the table, her own breath fogging in the frigid air of the module. She keyed on her digital recorder, but her usual clinical monotone was gone, replaced by a strained, incredulous whisper. Subject: Thomas Finch. Physical examination reveals no discernible cause of death. All biological systems are, for lack of a better word, flawless. She swallowed hard. Neurological scan indicates an extreme fear-based event, but there is no corresponding trauma. No anything. It's not possible. She switched off the recorder, the silence rushing back in. He's perfectly healthy, she murmured to the empty room. He's just dead. With a growing sense of dread, Elara opened the other 4 containers. The methodical scientist in her needed to confirm the pattern, while the human part of her prayed she wouldn't find one. The hiss of each seal breaking was like a gasp from the past. One by one, 4 more faces were revealed: a young radio operator, a grizzled ex-military navigator, the expedition's doctor, a woman, the lead archaeologist. Each one was a perfect, horrifying replica of the first, the same impossible preservation, the same mask of ultimate terror, and on each forehead the same alien geometric symbol, a brand of shared damnation. This was not an accident, this was an event. Packed away with their personal effects were their journals, 5 leather-bound volumes, their pages stiff with cold. Elara opened the first one, belonging to the archaeologist, Dr. Aris Thorne. The initial entries were exactly what she expected. Crisp, scientific logs detailing geological strata, magnetic field readings, and observations on the local flora. It was the detached language of her people, the comfortable prose of the observable world. But then, about 3 weeks into the expedition, the tone began to shift. The entries became shorter, the handwriting more jagged. The scientific observations were interspersed with unsettling remarks. "A strange resonance in the ice today," Thorne had written. "The dogs are spooked. They refuse to go near the western glacier." A week later, the descent steepened. The logs spoke of a cold that thinks, a pervasive feeling of being watched by the empty landscape itself. The last coherent entry was chilling. "Finch is dead." There was no sound, no warning. He just stopped. He screamed, but he never opened his mouth. We all heard it. The mark was on him when we found him, just like the carving in the cave. The final pages were filled with paranoid, disjointed scrawls, the same phrases repeated over and over. A presence in the ice. It's a thirst that isn't water. Don't let the warmth out. Elara looked at the bodies, then back at the journals. She was reading the last testaments of fellow scientists, people of logic, who, when faced with the inexplicable, had abandoned the language of science for the language of superstition and raw terror. And the terrifying thing was, every piece of physical evidence on her steel table told her they were right to do so. Elara stormed into Kane's office without knocking. She slammed a tablet down on his polished desk. The screen displayed a high-resolution image of the symbol from Finch's forehead, stark and undeniable. "Death by exposure," she said, her voice tight with a fury born of frustration and a creeping, unfamiliar fear. 5 bodies, all in perfect health, all dead from what appears to be sheer terror, all bearing this identical marking. Their journals describe a presence in the ice. You want to explain to me how any of that fits into your tidy little narrative, Silas? Kane didn't even flinch. He picked up the tablet, his expression one of mild, patronizing concern. Doctor, you've been working for nearly 24 hours straight in a highly stressful environment. It's understandable that you might be suggestible. He swiped a finger across the screen, dismissing the image. The terror you're seeing is likely a post-mortem artifact of freezing, a form of instantaneous rigor mortis. As for the journals, these people were suffering from extreme isolation, malnutrition, and hypoxia. It's a textbook recipe for cognitive breakdown, hallucinations, paranoia. Hypoxia-induced dementia can be a terrifying thing. Every word was a perfectly calibrated dismissal, a weaponization of scientific skepticism to invalidate her findings. And the mark? Elara pressed, refusing to be placated. Is that a symptom of dementia too? A shared hallucination that carved itself into their foreheads? She watched him closely, and for a split second, she saw it. A flicker in his eyes. A barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He knew what the symbol was. He was not ignorant. He was hiding something. The mask of calm slid perfectly back into place. He stood up, closing the file on his desk with a soft, final thud. Dr. Vance, your job, the job Norcorp is paying you an exorbitant amount of money for, is to provide a medical explanation based on the available evidence, he said, his voice dropping the pretense of warmth and taking on an edge of cold steel. Not to entertain campfire stories you found in the ramblings of dying men. He walked to his window, looking out at the endless white. Find one. Stonewalled, dismissed and simmering with a cold rage, Elara knew her investigation inside the station was over. Kane would block her at every turn, burying the truth under a mountain of corporate procedure. If science was a dead end, and authority was a locked door, she had only one path left, the one she had been trained her entire life to disdain. The path of campfire stories. She found Marco Gallo in the mess hall, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out at the white expanse. The small room was nearly empty, the low chatter of a few off-duty technicians doing little to fill the space. Elara slid into the chair opposite him, her movements stiff. She had to force herself to sound casual, a skill she rarely used. "Marco," she began, her voice lower than usual. "You mentioned you grew up around here. I have a question about some local art." He looked up, a hint of a smile on his face. "Art? Doc, the only art we got up here is frost on a window. It's a symbol," she pressed, keeping her eyes on the table. "A geometric pattern, all sharp angles." Marco's smile vanished. He put his mug down with a soft click and glanced around the mess hall, his relaxed demeanor evaporating. "Where did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's relevant to my work," she said, deliberately vague. He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Some things up here aren't work, Doctor. They're warnings." He looked around again, then continued. "That thing you're describing, it's old. Older than the stories even. The elders, they talk about it. There's an Inuit settlement a half-hour flight from here. If you really want to know, you need to talk to a man named Kenai. He's the one who keeps the history." Marco leaned back, picking up his mug but not drinking. He stared into the black coffee. "Just be aware," he said quietly. "Some things don't have a Norcorp report number. The flight to the settlement was a journey to another century." Marco piloted the ski plane with a quiet reverence, landing smoothly on a frozen inlet that served as the community's main street. Children in brightly colored parkas stopped their playing to watch the unfamiliar craft. The homes were a practical mix of modern necessity and deep-rooted tradition. Prefabricated walls were reinforced with sod, and a satellite dish was mounted incongruously on the roof of a small house from which a thin tendril of wood smoke curled into the crystalline air. This was Kenai's home. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smells of seal oil and smoke. The walls were covered in intricate carvings of animals and spirits. their wooden eyes seeming to follow Elara as she stepped in. An old man with a face like a wind-carved map of the tundra sat by a small stove. This was Kenai. His eyes, sharp and knowing, took her in. Elara began, her voice feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet space. "Mr. Kenai, my name is Dr. Vance. I'm a forensic pathologist with the Norcorp station. I'm investigating a series of fatalities, and my preliminary findings show certain physiological and neurological anomalies that don't align with standard models of death." Kenai listened patiently, his expression unchanging, as Elara stumbled through her clinical explanation. The words that were so powerful and precise in her lab sounded hollow and meaningless here. She felt like she was trying to describe the color blue to a man who had only ever seen white. Finally, she gave up. With a frustrated sigh, she pulled out her tablet. The cold blue light of the screen, an alien glow in the warm room. She navigated to the photo she had taken and turned it toward him. It was the image of the symbol on the dead man's forehead. Kenai's stoic expression dissolved. A deep sadness, ancient and profound, settled into his eyes. He reached out a gnarled hand, not to touch the tablet, but as if to ward off the image it displayed. "You have seen the mark of the Issiitok," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. The name itself seemed to make the room colder. He told her it was not a spirit, not a ghost that haunted the ice. The old stories described something far worse. The Issiitok, he explained, was a presence, a thing that envied warmth, a predator made of cold and hunger that slumbered in the deepest, oldest parts of the glacier. He described it as a form of life so ancient and alien that the human world had no category for it. It didn't kill with teeth or claws. It didn't need to. It simply drank. It would draw the heat and the life and the very soul from a person, leaving behind only a perfectly preserved shell, a hollow man frozen in the final moment of his terror. "The symbol is not something it carves," Kenai continued, his gaze distant, looking at a history only he could see. "It is the mark it leaves on that which it has tasted. It is a warning to others of its kind, a claim, a sign that says, 'This warmth was mine.'" He finally met Elara's eyes, and his were filled with a terrible gravity. "You did not find bodies in that cave, Doctor. You found what it left behind. The empty cups." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the small room. "And by bringing them to your station, full of lights and machines and living people, you have shown it where there is more warmth." The roar of the ski plane's engines was a welcome noise, a sound of science and machinery that pushed back against the heavy silence Kenai's story had left in its wake. Back in the temporary morgue, Elara paced like a caged animal. The two realities were at war in her mind. The logical, ordered world she had built her life around, and the terrifying, predatory world of Kenai's legend. "A predator that feeds on heat," she scoffed aloud, the sound of her own skepticism a comfort. "It's a myth, a folktale created to explain freak weather patterns." But the words felt hollow. The legend, as terrifying as it was, fit every single impossible fact on her table. The perfect preservation, the terror, the lack of any physical cause of death. She stopped pacing, her mind suddenly racing down a new, terrifyingly exciting path. The scientist in her, the part that loved a puzzle above all else, began to build a bridge. She grabbed her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she dictated a new log entry, her voice filled with a frantic energy. "New hypothesis," she began. "What if the Issiitok legend is a pre-scientific description of a biological organism, a previously undiscovered cryo-extremophile? Its method of predation could be misidentified as supernatural." She was thinking out loud, translating lore into science. "It could emit a targeted, low-frequency infrasound, undetectable to our ears, but capable of vibrating directly into the human nervous system, triggering the amygdala and inducing massive cardiac arrest. That would explain the terror. The feeding on warmth could be a form of rapid, endothermic energy absorption required for its sustenance. It's not a spirit, it's a hunter with a biological weapon. It was a theory, a wild, improbable theory, but it was a theory, and it was testable. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her. She was no longer just a pathologist. She was a xenobiologist on the verge of the discovery of a lifetime. To prove it, she needed uncontaminated samples, not from the bodies, from the site, from the creature's den. Kane, of course, forbade it. Absolutely not, he'd said over the comm, his voice flat and final. Your job is here, Doctor. Do not leave the station again. But Elara was done listening to Kane. She found Marco prepping the plane for a supply run. She laid out her new theory, the scientific language a comfort to them both. She wasn't chasing ghosts, she explained. She was hunting a biological specimen. He was hesitant, but the guilt of leaving her stonewalled, combined with his own deep-seated curiosity, won out. He agreed to fly her in secret under the cover of the long Arctic night. The ice cave was a wound in the side of a glacier, a jagged mouth leading into the planet's frozen heart. The air inside was different. It wasn't just cold, it was a dead, still cold, a palpable presence that seemed to actively suck the heat from her body. Elara switched on her headlamp, its beam cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. She saw the eerie, man-shaped depressions in the snow where the bodies had lain for 80 years. She immediately took out her portable sensor array. She scanned for radiation, for airborne toxins, for infrasound. Nothing. The air was clean. The readings were normal. Her hypothesis was failing its first test. Frustrated, she unpacked her ice drill, determined to get a core sample from the back wall of the cave. As the drill bit into the ancient ice, a high-pitched whine echoing in the confined space, her headlamp flickered violently. Once, twice. Then it held steady. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs, and in the sudden silence, she heard a new sound. It was a faint, dry, crackling noise, like the skittering of frozen leaves across pavement. It was coming from deep within the ice wall in front of her. Her headlamp flickered again, and in that split second of oscillating light and shadow, she saw it. For an instant, the beam illuminated the far wall of the cave, and there, inside, the solid, translucent ice, was a shape. It was tall and manlike, but it wasn't solid. It was a distortion, a shimmering patch of air like heat haze off a highway, only this was a pocket of absolute visual silence, a void that bent the light around it. It moved, a slow, fluidic turn within its frozen prison, a wave of pure, primal terror, the very same terror she had seen on the faces of the dead washed over her. It was not a thought. It was a command that bypassed her brain and went straight to her muscles. She scrambled backward, dropping the whirring drill. She turned and fled, not looking back. The sound of her own panicked gasps loud in the dead, silent cold of the cave. She slammed the door to her small quarters, the sound echoing the frantic, panicked rhythm of her own heart. Leaning back against it, she slid to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. Pale, gasping for breath, she clutched the single ice core sample in its insulated tube like a holy relic. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the one thing that could drag this experience out of the realm of terrifying hallucination and back into the world of measurable fact. Her hands trembled as she connected the portable analysis unit. The machine whirred to life, its low hum a comforting sound of reason in the suffocating silence of her fear. She inserted the sample, her eyes fixed on the small screen with a desperate, prayerful hope. The analysis began, lines of text scrolling past. She was looking for anomalies, for foreign proteins, for unknown organic compounds, for anything. The results appeared, stark and final. H2O, 99.9%. Trace minerals, consistent with local geology. Isotopic composition, consistent with local precipitation patterns over the last century. Elara stared at the screen, her mind refusing to process the words. It was water. Just water. ancient, frozen water. Her grand unified theory of a cryo-extremophile, of infrasonic predation, of a new form of life, all of it was a fantasy. A desperate attempt to fit an impossible truth into a scientific box too small to hold it. Kanai was right. She had not found a specimen. She had found a warning. Science had utterly failed her. Her tools, her methods, her entire worldview, all useless. A strangled cry of pure frustration escaped her lips. With a surge of rage, she grabbed the tablet and hurled it against the far wall. It struck with a sickening crack, the screen spiderwebbing into 1,000 fractured lines before going dark. Her fortress of logic had crumbled, and she was left alone with the terrifying certainty of what she had seen in the ice. She must have sat there for hours, lost in a stupor of fear and failure. She was startled back to the present by a heavy, authoritative knock at her door. Before she could answer, a keycard swiped the lock, and the door swung open. It was Kane. Flanked by 2 burly security guards whose faces were grim and impassive, he stood in the doorway like a judge delivering a sentence. Behind them, hovering in the hallway, was Marco. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his face a mask of shame and resignation. Kane's gaze swept the room, taking in her disheveled state and the broken tablet on the floor. His lips thinned in disapproval. "The flight logs are quite detailed, Doctor," he said, his voice cold and flat. "They tell me you took an unauthorized trip last night." He took a step into the room, his presence filling the small space. "I hired you to be a scientist. I hired you to be rational. Instead, you've been consorting with locals, chasing myths, and now taking joyrides in company property in the middle of the night. You have become a liability." He nodded to one of the guards. "Your contract with Norcorp is terminated, effective immediately. You will be confined to your quarters. Your network access has been revoked. The first supply plane out of here in 2 days will take you back to the mainland. Until then, you will not leave this room." He paused, his eyes like chips of ice. "I told you to stick to the facts, Doctor. You decided to go ghost hunting instead." He turned to leave, the guards moving to stand post outside her door. She was a prisoner, trapped. The word echoed in the oppressive silence of her small room. Outside, the world had vanished. A blizzard had descended upon the station, a raging wall of white that howled and shrieked through the module's seams. The station, once a bastion of technology, now felt like a tiny, fragile raft tossed on a furious, frozen ocean. The sense of isolation was absolute. With nothing left of her own science, Elara found herself drawn to the only other evidence she had. She picked up the dead expedition's journals, her hands trembling slightly in the dim light. She opened one and began to read, but this time, she was not reading as a skeptic looking for signs of madness. She was reading as a witness. The frantic, terrified scrawls were no longer the ravings of dying men. They were eyewitness accounts. They were testimony. One scientist, the expedition's doctor, had written, "It doesn't make a sound you hear with your ears. You hear it in your bones. A crackling cold that settles deep inside you, a cold that knows you're there." Elara shuddered, the memory of that dry, skittering sound in the cave vibrating through her own bones. Another entry from the archaeologist Aris Thorne read simply, "We are the fuel. It doesn't hate us. It doesn't even see us as life. We are just pockets of warmth in its endless cold, and it's burning us to stay cold." The words were a perfect, horrifying articulation of the presence she had felt in the cave. Not malice, but a vast, indifferent, and hungry emptiness. She had fully crossed the threshold. She was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. She was a believer, her faith forged not by a leap, but by the crushing weight of shared, documented experience. As if triggered by her realization, the main power to the station suddenly cut out. The low hum of the module's life support died, plunging her into absolute darkness and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. A moment later, emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly, pulsating red glow. The howl of the blizzard outside seemed to die down, or perhaps it was just her perception, her senses narrowing to a single point of focus. Because in the unnerving silence, she heard it, the sound from the cave, a dry, skittering, crackling noise. It wasn't outside, it was inside. It was coming from the small circular air vent on the ceiling directly above her bed. Her blood ran cold. She backed away, her eyes locked on the vent, her breath catching in her throat. She watched, paralyzed by a terror beyond anything she had ever known, as a delicate, intricate pattern of frost began to spread with unnatural speed across the inside of her small window. It radiated outward from a central point, spinning a web of impossible, crystalline beauty. The frost coalesced, its tendrils meeting and merging, forming sharp geometric lines. It was the symbol, the mark of the Issiitok. It was being drawn on her window from the inside out. The entity was here, and it knew exactly where she was. There was no time for thought, no time for fear. There was only the animal instinct to flee. Elara burst from her room, her mind a blank slate of pure, reactive survival. She plunged into the station's corridors, a maze of pulsing red emergency lights and deep, distorted shadows. The hunt was on. It was a cat-and-mouse game against a foe that defied the laws of physics. She never saw it, but she felt its presence everywhere. It was in the pockets of intense, unnatural cold that ambushed her at intersections, a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow. It was in the groaning protest of freezing metal overhead as the station's own structure buckled under its influence. And it was in the sound, that faint, dry, crackling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound that scraped along the edges of her hearing and vibrated deep in her bones. But her scientific mind, the part of her that had been useless for analysis, now became her greatest tool for survival. Thermodynamics. Heat moves from hot to cold. She didn't run randomly. She ran with purpose. Her mental map of the station was a map of heat sources. She sprinted from the residual warmth of a still-active server bank, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the hallways, to the insulated pipes of the water system, following the fading warmth of the station's dying heart. Reason had become her shield, a weapon to navigate a nightmare her reason could not explain. Her goal was the hangar, escape, the plane. Marco. He was a pilot. He would know what to do. She slammed through the final set of doors, stumbling into the vast cavernous space. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows. The ski plane stood waiting, a silent promise of a world beyond this frozen hell. And there was Marco. He was slumped against one of the plane's massive landing skis, looking small and defeated. A thin, delicate layer of frost covered his clothes, sparkling in the red light. Elara's heart seized. "Marco," she whispered, her voice cracking. She ran to him, her boots echoing in the cavernous silence. As she got closer, she saw his face. It was a perfect, horrifying replica of the 80-year-old corpse's. His eyes were wide with a silent, frozen scream. His skin was pale and waxy, and on his forehead, stark and clear, was the geometric symbol of the Issiitok. The last flicker of hope for escape died within her. There was no running, there was no leaving. The death of the pragmatic, good-natured pilot was the final, brutal proof. There was no middle ground in this conflict. The phenomenon was real, it was lethal, and it was here. The sight broke through her fear, the terror crystallizing into something hard and sharp. Resolve. She wouldn't run. She would fight. Kenai's words echoed in her mind. It envies warmth. An idea, desperate and terrible, formed. She turned her back on Marco and the useless promise of the plane and sprinted towards the one place in the station that held the most warmth, the most power, the generator room. The room was the thrumming, beating heart of the station, the source of all its life. A massive diesel engine hummed at its center, a bastion of noise and heat against the encroaching cold. And cowering behind a stack of fuel drums, she found him, Silas Kane. His expensive parka was torn, his face was ashen, and his eyes were wide with the same terror she had seen on all the others. His corporate swagger, his authority, his entire identity had been stripped away, leaving only a scared, babbling man. "I saw it," he whimpered, his voice trembling as he pointed a shaking finger at the solid metal wall. "It came through the wall. It doesn't use doors." Elara ignored his whimpering. Her mind was a razor, focused on a single terrifying calculation. She moved to the generator's main control panel, her fingers flying across the buttons, overriding safety protocols. "It's a thermodynamic predator," she said, her voice a low, intense monotone, speaking half to him, half to herself. "Its existence violates the second law. To maintain its state, it needs a steep enough thermal gradient. It needs to consume heat, so we'll give it some." As if her words had summoned it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The humming of the generator seemed to strain, the metal groaning as a wave of absolute cold washed over them. The crackling sound was deafening now. In the center of the room, the air began to shimmer. It coalesced into a tall, human-shaped void, a distortion in space that bent the light around it, a hole in the world sucking in all heat and light. It turned its silent, featureless face toward Elara. "Do something!" she screamed at Kane, not looking away from the panel, her hands a blur of motion. In that final moment, the terrified bureaucrat vanished, and a man emerged. With a guttural cry of pure, desperate defiance, Kane grabbed a heavy steel wrench from a nearby toolbox and hurled it at the entity. It was a futile, human gesture, a rock thrown at a god. But it was enough. The wrench passed through the shimmering void and clattered uselessly against the far wall, but the entity turned its attention. It glided silently toward Kane. It reached out a single shimmering arm. Where the distortion touched his chest, Kane's terrified scream was cut short. He froze solid instantly, an ice statue in mid-cry, his face locking into the familiar mask of ultimate terror. Then, with a soft crack, he toppled over and shattered on the concrete floor like glass. The momentary distraction was all she needed. With a triumphant cry, Elara slammed her palm down on a large red button covered by a plastic shield. A klaxon began to blare, its deafening whoop echoing through the room. A synthesized voice announced, "Warning, core overload imminent. Detonation in 10 seconds. But Elara didn't run. She stood her ground. Her eyes scanned the room and found what she was looking for, a discarded emergency flare. With practiced movements, she tore off the cap and struck the igniter. It erupted in a brilliant, blinding orange light, a miniature sun of pure chemical heat. The entity turned from the shattered, frozen remains of Kane. Its hunger, its very nature, was drawn to this new, intense point of warmth. It glided toward her, a void coming to consume the flame. Holding the brilliant orange light like a torch, Elara stared into the heart of the abyss, keeping its attention locked on her. 10, 9, 8. She held its gaze, the intense cold washing over her, the flare sputtering in her hand. 3, 2, and 1. At the last possible second, she threw the flare into the creature's face and dove behind the massive engine block as the generator and the entire world exploded in a silent, all-consuming fireball. What do we do when our most trusted tools for understanding the world simply break? This story pushes us right to that edge. Dr. Vance begins as a fortress of logic, believing every mystery can be neatly dissected and labeled. But the Issiitok isn't a problem that can be solved with a scalpel. What's fascinating is that she doesn't just surrender to superstition. Instead, she attempts something far more difficult. She tries to translate it. The Elder Kenai's ancient legend isn't just a ghost story, it's a data set. It offers a complete, terrifyingly accurate model of the threat. It envies warmth, he says. That single poetic line becomes the key to a scientific solution. Elara takes this piece of folklore and reforges it into a weapon of applied thermodynamics. The story suggests that maybe science and superstition aren't always polar opposites. Sometimes they might just be different languages trying to describe the same incomprehensible thing. One uses the language of myth and metaphor, the other the language of math and measurement. But what if both are pointing at the same truth, lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding? It makes you wonder about the nature of explanation itself. When faced with the truly unknown, which is more valuable? A comforting, logical theory that doesn't fit the facts, or a terrifying story that explains everything?